in Pursuit of Intimations, in praise of non-methodologies in writing art histories. What happens when a work of art reminds us of a work of literature, despite bearing no clear historical, thematic or causal relationship? What value is there to following up on such resonances? How might this approach enable us to better understand the objects of our attention or our responses to them? And how might our method of writing be harnessed to generate, not just communicate, such kinships? What does the work of Peter Doig have to do with the work of Walter Pater? Or the work of Susan Sontag with the work of Zurbarán, Francisco de Zurbarán? Or the work of Michael Simpson and the work of Gertrude Stein? Though this paper doesn't focus on any of these examples per se, it considers the implications at stake in the thinking and writing of pairings such as these into being. Michael Oakeshott, philosopher and political theorist, criticised the imposition of abstract theoretical models without adapting to the needs or requirements of real-world situations. Thinking, he says, is developed not by applying pre-existent methodologies, but by exploring and pursuing what is intimated by real-world situations. Political thought, he believed, should be adaptive and responsive. This paper argues that the same goes for art history. Methodologies and approaches should not be imposed upon artworks, but should be allowed to emerge by intimation from our encounters with them and our encounters through and our writing through those encounters. Oakeshott sees scholarship, research and writing as an open pursuit akin to a metaphorical conversation. Scholarship, Oakeshott writes, is not an enterprise designed to yield extrinsic profit, a contest where a winner gets a prize, and nor is it an activity of exegesis. Oakeshott's model allows for different universes, and I quote here, different universes of discourse to meet, acknowledge each other, and enjoy an oblique relationship. He envisions scholarship as something like a stage on which a series of intellectual discussions enter, meet, attract, repel, and sometimes, though not necessarily, merge, echo, and even cross-fertilise. Scholarship played out like this in and through conversation, real or imaginary, internalised or externalised, poses considerable risks. Oakeshott's conversation is active, reflective and reflexive, a mode through which we contemplate poetic imagining. And that's his quote, poetic imagining. Artists, writers and philosophers, Oakeshott argues, are not doing two things, and here I'm quoting again, they are not doing two things, observing, thinking, remembering, hearing, feeling, etc., and then expressing or making analogues, imitations, or reproductions of what they've seen, heard, remembered, felt, etc., in the practical world, and doing it well or ill, correctly or incorrectly. They are doing one thing, imagining poetically. It is, as Oakeshott puts it, an unrehearsed intellectual adventure, enacting, and again, as Oakeshott puts it, a specific mode of imagining and moving about among images. As I continue this talk, hold that thought of moving about among images in a way that runs parallel to the content of the paper. The slides I'm using sometimes fall into sync with my words, but often they are intended as a means to enact the spirit of the ideas of the paper. But is it art history? Art historian Gavin Parkinson characterises prevailing art histories as entailing, and here I'm quoting, the communication of thoughts, feelings, findings and arguments about objects, events and the past by means of the carefully and coherently organised plan, observation of and respect for causality and the clock and calendar time of the world, dissolution of authorship or announcement of subjectivity in the capture of the surveyed material, use of reason in search of rational connectivity between human beings, their contexts, behaviour and work, and the exercise of balance and critical distance in search of underlying motivations, interpreting phenomena in the services of conclusivity by means of methods that mimic those of scientific causality, whether this goes undeclared or not. This paper offers a supplement to the rational orthodoxy, as Parkinson puts it, of the kinds of art histories which he describes and implicitly questions. My approach is to replace what Parkinson characterises as art history's organised plan with a more gradual, responsive and piecemeal approach to research materials as in process. I sideline a respect for causality in favour of serendipity, anachronism and the lyrical. And rather than rational connectivity, I call on something more like an intuitive connectivity, or intimations. I make use of, on the whole, proximity rather than distance, steering clear of scientific causality. And finally, rather than dissolution of authorship, I offer an enactment of an active, morphing subjectivity which determines and is determined by the form, content and tone of its research materials, rather than the more static, positional announcement of subjectivity that Parkinson identifies. I'm not, however, suggesting a wholesale debunking of existing art historical methodologies. What I'm advocating for is a methodological pluralism. Methodologies all tackle their research from a specific point of view with a specific approach, and all add something. But when we constrain ourselves too strictly within any given predetermined methodology, we give the impression of knowing in advance what we're looking for and how we will unearth it. In the process, inevitably, we leave something out. Instead, I look to the possibility that we, as researchers, and the objects and subjects of our research might change through our encounters. Such an approach is inherently open-ended, responsive, and one which reflects on its material as it goes along. I've come to see it as a non-methodology. By not choosing a particular methodology in advance, it's incumbent upon the researcher to listen more deeply, more openly to the material they're looking at, reading and thinking about. I hold the words of Pauline Oliveros dear. Quantum listening, she writes, simultaneously creates and changes what is perceived. The perceiver and the perceived co-create through the listening effect. All sounds are included in the field. This creates potential, cultivates surprises, opens the imagination and approaches and even plunges over the edges of perception. We'd be hard pushed to argue that there isn't value to seeing art historical writing as at once creating and changing what it perceives. The risk with allowing these kinds of thoughts to run wild is that what results might be seen as a random accumulation of half-baked, unfounded, stream of consciousness ideas that spew out in all directions with no clear discernible logic and no value to anyone else. But rather, I characterise this as a kind of morphological thinking. This is how conversations emerge and how resonances appear and cross-fertilised through real-world encounters with artwork and works of literature and ideas. Writer Y.G. Dimmock their take on literary history, for example, is the result of what she calls site-specific input generating a variable morphology. Her metaphorically inflected creative thinking around literary history sees her modelling what she calls a diachronic historicism on the travelling frequencies of sound that are suggestive of the travelling frequencies of literary texts, frequencies received and amplified across time, moving farther and farther from their points of origin, causing unexpected vibrations in unexpected places. But what are the consequences of following the traces of unexpected vibrations to the wider discipline of art history? What is its use? In art historian Matthew Rampley's article, The Poetics of the Image, Art History and the Rhetoric of Interpretation from 2008, he outlines points of potential friction for such an approach. Rampley discusses the impact that the poetic approaches of Roberto Longhi, Adrian Stokes, Mika Ball and George D.D. Huberman have had on art history. He sees theirs as alternatives to what he calls the scientific methods of doing art history, which bury the artwork in a formidable apparatus of dry scholarly analysis that robs it of its specificity to such an extent that its cultural and aesthetic value become lost, resulting, he says, in an unwelcome taming. Though describing the work of these poetic art histories as striking, here I'm quoting, striking, remarkable, novel, important and even astonishing, Rampley remains sceptical, the reasons for which are revealing. He is convinced, for example, by Ball's assumption that, and quoting here, one's subjective position can be rendered transparent, leading him to judge her observations as having little relevance to the discipline. He sees D.D. Huberman's determination not to attempt to elucidate the uncertainty of the image through a systematic approach to interpretation as offering no theory of interpretation at all, but rather an account of aesthetic experience. He sees Stokes's writing as too individual, too rooted in his personal aesthetic absorption in stone for it to serve as a means of constructing a shared community of knowledge, and he objects to the way that Longhi's descriptions are rooted in a highly aesthetic response which can neither be challenged nor confirmed and cannot therefore serve as a prompt for further historical investigation. Rampley's critique turns on two cruxes. The first is that though those poetic forms of writing are acts of resistance against the deadening grip of systematic analysis that has been such a central force within so much art historical discourse, close brackets, they fail to posit an alternative. His second critique is split into two related parts. On the one hand, it is founded on Rampley's idea of knowledge to which art historical writing should give rise. But it also leads to a questioning of the relationship between the personal nature of responses and or interpretation and their usefulness for the collective labour of the discipline. In sum, Rampley's examples are evidence of individual anomalies, but their importance to the future of art history is limited because they've not spawned sufficient followers. He concludes, considering the four authors I've examined, it appears, while the weaknesses within art history are exposed, constructing a counter-discourse creates as many difficulties as it solves. The image remains tamed, albeit in a different way. What does emerge out of this discussion is the need to consider not simply the contribution of individual authors, but also more fundamental issues to do with the status of art history as a shared enterprise and the implications that might have for critical assessment of how art historical knowledge is generated, what knowledge in this context means, and to whom it is addressed. But perhaps we need to have another look at what constitutes poetry or the poetic. Michael Oakeshott defines it as the activity of making images of a certain kind and moving them in a manner appropriate to their character. And here I'm quoting. Making images of a certain kind and moving about among them in a manner appropriate to their character. This moving about among visual and verbal images in a manner appropriate to their character is the approach I'm advocating for here. Identifying such appropriateness of character involves a process in which multiple strands need careful and simultaneous attendance, negotiating the felt experience of close seeing and reading, maintaining the connection between words and images that suggest themselves in the moment of writing, following those relationships to test how far they can take us, and regarding those words through which those relationships emerge as enmeshed and illuminative in their own right. I refer to Rampley's critique of poetic art histories, but his reading begs a series of questions that are fundamental and worth unpicking further. How should we define the type of insight that stems from poetic art histories? Can that insight be considered knowledge? And is it useful? To recap, for Rampley, poetic art histories are A. Too subjective to have any claim or value as conveyors of knowledge, partly because you cannot confirm or deny observations. They are impossible to defend discursively. B. They have spawned no followers and therefore function as anomalies rather than useful contributions to what he calls the collective enterprise of art history. And C. Use language that supplants or suppresses the objects they claim to address. To counter Rampley's claim that poetic art histories are unarguable, I looked at Oakeshott's idea of the pursuit of intimations. Though dissimilar in subject matter, the spirit of Oakeshott's approach finds affinity with mine. His core criticism is of abstract theoretical models, as I spoke about at the beginning of this paper, and methodologies being put into practice, imposed upon a political situation without adapting to the needs or requirements of the real-world situations in which they find themselves. Thinking, he says, is developed not by applying pre-existent methodologies, but by the amendment of existing arrangements, exploring and pursuing what is intimated by them or intimated in them. Political thought, he believes, should be adaptive, responsive and sensitive to its real-world environment, much as, I argue, that art historical methodologies should not be imposed upon artworks, but that particular approaches to and means of writing about artworks should be allowed to emerge from our encounters with them. I have much sympathy with Oakeshott's approach as encouraging thought as ongoing practice rather than the execution of a fixed utopian ideal where understanding is invited, welcomed for its sensitivity and adaptiveness. And there are those quotes I was just reading. Oakeshott's intimations, Wai-Chi Dimmock's vibrations, Pauline Oliveros' quantum listening all share a belief that no fixed methodology can or should be adopted. To do so is to impose upon the subjects and objects of our research, to create the impression of hierarchies of knowledge and the possibilities of mastership. Non-methodological approaches don't purport to know in advance which approaches are best suited in any given circumstances. Instead, they look, they listen, they think with and alongside and through as they go along. Non-methodologies allow us to pursue intimations, to follow our guts and our noses, alert to our aesthetic and emotional and conceptual encounters, adapting to the moment and the site and the conglomerations of these encounters. Non-methodologies find kinship with Susan Sontag's call for more subtle, more engorged ways of knowing, of sympathising, as she put it, or the way that what is important now is to recover our senses. We must learn to see more, to hear more, to feel more. It finds kinship in what anthropologist Tim Ingold would call a forging of a different way of thinking about how we come to know things, not through engineering a confrontation between theories in the head and the facts on the ground, but rather through joining with the things themselves in the very process of thought. Thank you.